activism on the south side of Chicago. She founded the People for Community Recovery in 1979 in an effort to get asbestos out of the buildings in her community. I'm proud that Celeste Flores traveled here from Illinois to share how her organization is continuing the work Hazel started. So, what exactly does environmental justice look like? As Cornell University researchers Gary Evans and Elise Kantrowitz wrote in 2002, and I quote, "The more researchers scrutinize environmental exposure and health data for racial and income inequalities, the stronger the evidence becomes that grave and widespread environmental injustice have occurred throughout the United States." Last year, the American Journal of Public Health published a study that found a disproportionate burden from particulate matter pollution on African Americans. And Scientific American reported in 2012 that, and I quote, "the greater the concentration of Hispanics, Asians, African Americans, or poor residents in an area, the more likely that potentially dangerous compounds such as vanadium, nitrates, and zinc are in the mix of fine particles that they breathe," unquote. Simply put, generations of economic and racial inequalities have disproportionately exposed workers, low-income communities, communities of color, and others to low wages, toxic pollution, and climate threats. As climate change intensifies, these communities face more powerful storms and floods, more intense heat waves, more deadly wildfires, more extreme droughts, and suffer other devastating effects of the climate crisis on top of the highest levels of toxic pollution found nationwide. That is why the special committee has convened this hearing and why we hope you will consider this meeting today the first of a long-term relationship of collaboration. All of us here today are committed to ensuring that justice is the foundation of our nation's environmental and economic policies. We support national climate action that prioritizes helping the hardest hit workers and communities while addressing legacy pollution. Thank you again for joining us today, for fighting on behalf of communities who need our assistance, and on sharing your expertise. And I will defer Ranking Member Carper's remarks until he gets here. And in the meantime, I would like our witnesses to begin. Dr. Martinez, if you would.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth and Senator Schatz, for this opportunity to speak to you today on climate change and environmental justice. My name is Cecilia Martinez. I am from Taos, New Mexico, and I currently serve as the Executive Director for the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy in Minneapolis, Minnesota. As you so eloquently already stated, the problem of climate change is the result of the operations of a carbon-based economy. But it is an economy which has also created an unequal society whereby disproportionate pollution and economic burdens are borne by indigenous, communities of color, and low-income communities. As the research consistently shows, the racial and economic disparities in every sector of U.S. society, whether it be housing, health, transportation, education, or employment, is also evident in climate change. These unequal conditions demand an urgency to act. Yet this urgency must not displace or abandon the fundamental principles of democracy and justice. A critically important issue is how well we are incorporating equity into climate mitigation solutions. The shift to a non-GHG future will require new policy, new regulatory frameworks, and substantial new public and private capital investment. As the canaries in the coal mine, EJ communities know about the need for such change because they have directly experienced the environmental and health consequences of past pollution. But what we fear most as we move forward is the potential for climate solutions to actually worsen economic and environmental inequality. There have been deep historical conflicts about what a climate policy agenda for the U.S. should include, even among proponents for climate action. The root of this division was whether equity should be a central component of climate policy. Over a year ago, an effort was launched to bring together national environmental organizations, environmental justice leaders, and a couple of science and policy think tanks to see if we could agree upon a national climate agenda. This year-long process has resulted in what I'm proud to say, a historic agreement that is outlined in the Equitable and Just Climate Platform. This platform that outlines climate solutions that do not and will not leave any community behind. I will not go into all the platform components. I just want to highlight 3 key elements. The first is an emphasis on cumulative impacts and emissions reductions. Environmental justice communities unfortunately experience multi-contaminant pollution, often from multiple sources. And the second is on the climate platform calls for a pollution-free energy economy, and the third is that our platform calls for environmental justice review and analysis. We hope that the components of this just and equitable climate platform will be incorporated into future efforts for legislation at the federal level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Schatz and members of the committee. My name is Michelle Roberts. I'm the National Co-Coordinator of the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. EJHA is what we call ourselves. We are a national collective of grassroots environmental justice groups located around the United States. We, along with the other over 200 groups, endorse the Equitable and Just Climate platform. We appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. First off, we want to put it on the record that the EJHA, that environmental justice and economic justice is climate justice. Climate and economic justice issues are not separate and distinct from environmental justice. Comprehensive climate or EJ legislation must ensure that climate change is mitigated to the greatest extent possible and that unavoidable impacts are addressed justly. This means acknowledging that while everyone will be impacted by climate change, the impacts are not spread around equally. They are very often the communities hit first and worst are those of EJ communities who have not contributed to this challenge. Climate is a risk multiplier. EJ communities are disproportionately impacted by the cumulative impacts of multiple source pollution, as you indicated, Senator Duckworth. When we really think about it and think about our transatlantic slave trade route, think about that. Those are many of the communities who are actually hurt, displaced, and never to return back to their communities. This is why in which we believe that this disproportionate impact and cumulative risk impacts need to date back to that of the most impacted egregious actions on our communities. Climate change presents additional and unique challenges to communities that are already overburdened and impacted by cumulative impacts. The Southbridge community in Wilmington, Delaware, where my family is originally from, is one example of a community dealing with the cumulative impacts of climate-induced flooding, air pollution, legacy contamination, substandard housing conditions, institutionalized racism, and historic political disinvestment. The historic community of Mossville, Louisiana, founded by formerly enslaved people, is yet another. Mossville residents are surrounded by over 17 high-risk facilities that are disproportionate risk from extreme weather events like hurricanes. Equitable and just climate policies must address cumulative impacts. As you heard Dr. Cecilia Martinez indicate, communities do not get to process different kinds of pollutions in silos. Their bodies or deal with the impacts of climate change separate from the rest of their lived experience. Therefore, it is imperative that we point to a process whereby which our communities are definitely engaged in the process from that of a bottom-up process, including in with this legislation. I thank you very much for your time and welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Flores.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Celeste Flores, and I'm the Lake County Outreach Director for Faith in Place and the co-chair for Clean Power Lake County. And on behalf of our communities, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to provide testimony today. I'm a daughter of an immigrant, proud Chicana, and first college generation student. I was born and raised in Lake County, and I didn't learn about environmental justice until I saw the devastation of mountaintop removal in Kentucky. And that, as a person of faith, I felt morally challenged to know my luxuries affected the lives of my brothers and sisters and of this planet. After graduation, I spent a year in AmeriCorps in Appalachia until I finally returned home to learn about the local opportunities of environmental justice work. I began as a volunteer with Clean Power Lake County, and our mission is to organize within frontline communities, environmental justice communities, to shift Lake County towards a healthy, renewable energy and to achieve self-determination for immigrant, low-income, and working-class families. Like so many in my community, I was unaware that I grew up in a festline community, that I spent most of my childhood within miles of a coal fire plant and 5 Superfund sites. It wasn't until my return that I became educated on the environmental injustices that existed. That was 5 years ago. I never imagined I would have moved back home to work at my local church and become an expert on particulate matter, coal plants, the PJM grid, capacity market, coal ash, Superfund sites, ethylene oxide, let alone to organize a whole community to demand our basic rights to breathe clean air, drink clean water, and have a healthy land. Waukegan is predominantly a Latinx, African-American, low-income, working-class community. And the town was once booming with the economy that was left behind when industry abruptly left and took all its resources and polluted our land, our air, and our water. And now it's up to us to clean that all up. And we're still dealing with that pollution. Growing up, I didn't know that the apartments I visited every weekend, there was a landfill considered a Superfund site by the EPA. I remember asking why the fence was around the land, and I was just told that it must be private property. And this is what companies are relying on, that communities don't ask questions, and they're making a profit on the most vulnerable communities and keeping us in the dark. When I first learned about the coal plants, I would ask everyone if they knew that there was a coal plant in our community, and some thought growing up they were told it was a cloud factory. Others thought it was clean now because there was no gray dust on our cars when we woke up in the mornings. Others thought we had to have this coal plant in order to have energy. These are all false notions that the industry has created to help continue gaining of our communities. And the company Energy that owns the coal plant on our lakefront even hired a former city employee to be their lobbyist. Environmental justice communities like Waukegan deal with a lot of cumulative impact, which you've already heard. And this is what we're asking. We're asking for you guys, for the senators, to be able to sit with us as environmental justice community leaders and think about next steps of how we're going to be addressing this holistically and not in silos, and having federal agencies like the EPA come into our communities and actually educate us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And I'd like to invite our ranking member of the Environment and Public Works Committee, Senator Carper, to give his opening remarks.
Thank you, Senator. Boy, two of you look pretty familiar. Have you ever been to Delaware? Huh? Nice to see you both.
Nice to see you.
Dr. Martinez, Michelle, welcome. Celeste, welcome.
Thank you.
Would you ever want to go to Delaware? Yeah. Have a lot of people go
I've got
through
great
Delaware.
friends there.
Well, we're delighted that you're here. I just want to say to Senator Duckworth, many thanks for convening an important conversation on the impacts of climate change on environmental justice communities. And so thank you for your leadership on this important issue. To all my other colleagues here, Brian and everyone else, Sheldon, Jeff, I'm honored to serve with all of you. I just want to say that history tells us, Harry Truman used to say, the only thing new in the world is a history we forgot or never learned. Think about that. The only thing new in the world is the history we forgot or never learned. And history tells us that environmental progress has not always been distributed equally. Like so many environmental issues, climate change disproportionately affects impoverished and disadvantaged communities of color, and indigenous communities as well. More often than not, low-income, minority and indigenous communities are located downstream and downwind from dangerous pollution or near industrial facilities or factories. And not far from where my wife and I live in Wilmington, Delaware, there are, we're probably less than half a mile from I-95 and just a couple of miles from I-495. It's great that we have that kind of interstate transportation, that we can go places, get places quickly, whether you want to go north, south, west. We can't go very far east, but we'll be in the drink. But there's a downside as well. There's a lot of pollution that flows from this. You may recall that the greatest source of carbon pollution on our planet is our cars, trucks, and vans. And it's not just carbon pollution that they put out. They emit a lot of other stuff that is not good for us. But we're a downwind state, and they don't like to say this, but I've said, as my colleagues have heard me say more than a few times, and when I was governor of Delaware, I could have shut down the state. Every car, truck, van off the roads, every factory, every business closed, we'd still be out of compliance for clean air in Delaware, because we get about 90% of the air pollution comes from outside of our state and from those that are literally passing through. And while people living in communities along I-95, off of I-95, along I-495, suffer from greater air pollution, they're also less likely to have access to quality, affordable health care to address illnesses that come from breathing dirty air. And that's despite our efforts to try to extend coverage to a lot of the folks a lot of communities I just mentioned. That's just not fair to them. And even worse, experts tell us that climate change going forward will only make this problem worse, not better. According to National Climate Assessment, climate change is expected to increase smog and soot pollution significantly, resulting in more asthma, along with greater incidence of lung disease and deaths, and increasing healthcare costs by up to $26 billion each year. We know that the burden of this pollution and the cost in dollars and in lives will fall disproportionately on lower-income, minority, and indigenous communities. That could be said of most of the climate change effects we're expected to see in the near future. From the more severe storms and rising seas along our coast, Delaware is the lowest-lying state in America. My state is sinking, and the seas around us, as you know, our witnesses know, are rising. There's an area just on the southern edge of Wilmington. It's called South Ridge, and it's a low-lying, predominantly African-American working-class neighborhood. An average rainfall or snowmelt can cause significant tidal flooding there in areas close to the Christina River. And worsening storms and sea level rise will only make this problem grow worse. Although we know that low-income, minority, and indigenous communities are poised to suffer the most from climate change and its impacts, too often the concerns of these communities take a backseat. Again, that's not right either. My colleagues hear me quote the Golden Rule from time to time, the idea that we ought to treat other people the same. As it turns out, I was surprised to learn this a few years ago. The Golden Rule is actually not just in the Bible. It's not referenced to just in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's in every major religion on the world. And if you happen to be Jewish, it's there. If you happen to be a Muslim, it is there. If you happen to be Buddhist, Hindu, you name it. Everybody of the major religions have a Golden Rule. And we ought to be guided, regardless of what our faith beliefs are, of the idea, the notion that we should treat other people the way we want to be treated. In that spirit, earlier this year, I joined Senators Duckworth and Booker to form the, thank you, Senator Duckworth, to form the Senate's first ever Environmental Justice Caucus. And now I understand we're up to 15 members. And one of in the Navy, the people that are there first, we call them plank holders. Plank holders. We now have 15 members, and one of our goals is to advocate environmental justice issues using just about every platform available to us here in the Senate. Our caucus members plan to examine the inequities facing our country's environmental justice communities in the days to come, and to work together to find ways to ensure that these communities no longer go ignored or feel forgotten. In our country today, a clear majority of Americans is calling on Congress to address the grave threat that climate crisis poses to our country and to our planet, and in many cases to our communities. As we listen to that clarion call for climate action, we have to ensure that the voices of our environmental justice communities are heard as well. Simply put, we need to ensure that our policy solutions to address climate change protect and benefit the communities that bear the brunt of climate change. As the senior Democrat on the Environment and Public Works Committee, I'm privileged to serve with most of the people at this dais. But I look forward to working with them and others who have joined us today. I look forward to working with our Environmental Justice Caucus members. And we have a saying in Delaware. I don't know a lot of Latin, but the two of the words I do know are carpe diem, which means seize the day. In Delaware, we say Carper diem. So. And with that, I conclude my remarks. Again, to our witnesses, thank you all very, very much for being here. Welcome. Go Blue.
Thank you, Ranking Member Carper. I would like to recognize a Senator from Hawaii, Senator Schatz, for his questioning.
Thank you very much, Senator Duckworth, and thank you to all the testifiers. I'm reading the principles around just climate legislation, and without belaboring the point, I agree. And I want you to know that I agree. The question I have, as we think through environmental injustice over centuries, really, but a lot of it ongoing, can you give us a pathway or some examples of where it's being done right? Because I think that at least on both sides of this dais, we're very well aware of the acute injustice related to pollution and pollution events. But if we're going to move forward together with climate legislation, I think local communities doing it right, being supported by their local government, their state government, the not-for-profit community. I'm really interested, and I have a couple of examples from Hawaii, but I want to hear from you about where is it being done right and how can we integrate that into the work of the EPW committee and the work of Senate Democrats as we move forward towards climate legislation. And I'll start with Dr. Martinez.
Thank you, Senator Schatz. I'm going to have a two-part question to that. I think one of the challenges we have from the environmental justice community is that the policy design and the policy solutions have been formulated over a period of several years and decades. Unfortunately, the particular situation of environmental justice communities in the formulation of those policy designs has meant that we have moved forward substantially with some potential good policies, but to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the problem is, have they also included equity for environmental justice communities? And unfortunately, the prime examples that are often cited, either at state level policies or at regional level policies, have not incorporated equity or environmental justice. And so the challenge is, while we reduce greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate, do we do so at the cost of a distributional inequality? Right. In other words, do some communities actually result in higher emissions? So I think there's that piece that we need, and that's why we need more EJ assessments around that. I think there are at the local level numerous examples that cities are developing, and obviously that states are pushing on in terms of renewable portfolio standards, et cetera. I know in the city of Minneapolis, we were instrumental in developing the green zone. We borrowed it from California, and it was actually developed with environmental justice partners and environmental justice researchers. A more holistic approach that builds in multi-sector efforts and infrastructure building to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to reduce overpollution in those communities and to build up green investment.
And I'm going to sort of amend my question in the interest of time to see if I can work one more aspect of this in before my time has expired. But it occurs to me that the more urgent need is to address pollution, unfairness, and then as we try to deal with carbon pollution in particular, that we don't exacerbate and make worse these injustices. Okay, we've got it. This is not to say that's an easy proposition, but we certainly understand it in our brains and in our guts. But it's not just about mitigating harm. It's also about the opportunity that climate action presents to the overall economy. And I'll draw an analogy between the sort of de facto legalization of marijuana, right? And the people who are benefiting from that are not the people who were harmed from the prosecution of marijuana cases. In fact, in many cases, it's the business establishment in all of our hometowns who are getting more rich, and the sort of upper crust who are now, infusing their marijuana into wine and having all kinds of fun with it, and are almost gleeful and trendy about it, and putting it on Instagram, and yet there are still people incarcerated. And so the question I have for you is how do we make sure that if we're going to make massive investments, as will be necessary, in a clean energy future and in environmental mitigation. How do we make sure that the communities that have been impacted historically benefit from the economic opportunity, not just that we don't make it worse, but in fact that we make it better through opportunities for entrepreneurship, through money flowing into communities that have been ignored for a long time. And I'll, starting with Ms. Roberts and then Ms. Flores, and then my time will be up.
Thank you for that. That's a very good question, and we can look at the case in point in the city of Wilmington, Delaware, where I'm from, the communities of Southbridge, where my family is from, the ways in which we identify and do create brownfield economic developments, and the inclusion of that brownfield economic development to that of the opportunity zone that we talk about today. Today, the way in which that structure is designed, it does not include input of the community at all. And so therefore, there is an inequitable economic development, and this is why communities like the folks in Wilmington and other places are leaning to technical advisors such as Dr. Martinez as we look at this green zone development process, economic development process that must be a bottom-up process that includes communities at the base level. I hear what you're saying, that it's very hard to mitigate pollution, but what you must understand is that the communities continue to endure that. So unless we have a full systems approach, a full just transition, a full holistic way in which of this economic development, there will never be an economic development within these communities that will be fair and just, and that all will benefit. There will always be negative externalities that we will have to continue to pay. When you look at a case in point at the Regenesis community down in Spartanburg, South Carolina, that's a beautiful process, but right now, it too is held up in a logjam because of the fact that this was something that was developed for, with, and by communities. But once those big economic, no disrespect to them, the economic engine saw the actual benefits of it all. Now here it is subject, the communities themselves are subjected to having to fight to stay in and at the table. So there must be equitable, just, and fairness in these development processes, and a way in which they have the capacities necessary to be able to compete in these processes.
My time is up. I'm sorry, Ms. Flores, but I'm sure there will be questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you. We have actually upcoming votes that will be called, and in light of that, I'm going to defer my questions into the end to allow my colleagues. We actually have quite a number of senators here, and thank you to each of you for giving us of your time. And I am pleased to announce that Senator Peters just joined, so we're now 16 members of the caucus of the coalition. And I'd like to recognize Senator Carper for his questions.
Thank you. I'm happy to yield to others who've been waiting. If y'all have places you need to go and things you need, I'm happy to yield.
Well, next is Senator Baldwin, if she would like to go.
Yeah, go ahead. Just don't take my questions.
Are you asking Wisconsin questions?
Probably not.
Okay, we're going to be safe, I think. I wanted to start with, as I hinted, a couple of Wisconsin-specific questions, although I'm sure they apply far beyond that. In Wisconsin, we have proud traditions of hunting and fishing, and many Wisconsinites, including some of our tribal communities, rely significantly on hunting and fishing to feed their families and their entire communities, and they have for generations. I would add to hunting and fishing wild ricing as a staple for a lot of our northern tribes, the Ojibwe bands of Indians particularly. I have, in recent years, seen firsthand in visits to northern Wisconsin the shrinkage of the acreage on which one can actually grow wild rice. and it's quite significant over time, very clearly related to climate change. So I wonder if you can speak to how climate change and other environmental justice issues, particularly toxic pollution, on which I have another question, uniquely impact those who hunt and gather wild sources of food, and what we should be looking at to mitigate those damages. And for anyone who, Dr. Martinez.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. You've hit on a really fundamental question that's dear to my heart. As the first peoples in this country, the fact that indigenous peoples are suffering these kinds of climate impacts is critically important. It is important in terms of sustenance and subsistence, but it's also important because of the deep cultural relevance of the ecosystem and the environment to indigenous peoples. So you mentioned wild rice. Wild rice is not only a form of sustenance, but it's a deeply held sacred food for the Ojibwe. I think one of the ways in which we can most significantly honor and build solutions is to empower tribes to invest greater public funding for tribes. There are a number of tribes across the country who have taken this up and who are leaders in dealing with both climate adaptation, climate resiliency, and climate mitigation. But as always, resources are a challenge. Using traditional practices among indigenous people can provide us with important answers, not just for the tribal communities, but also for society as a whole. So I would say I would start there. Thank you.
Thank you. I see my time has expired.
Thank you. Senator Smith.
There. Can you hear me? Yes, there. First of all, Dr. Martinez, it's so wonderful to welcome you to Washington, and thank you for all of your work as a fellow Minnesotan. I'm really, really proud that you're here. And you know, one of the things that I am thinking about here, I'm going to actually just go to a bit of your testimony and ask you to elaborate on it some. You say in your testimony that to effectively address climate change, the national climate policy agenda must drive actions that result in real benefits to at the local and community level, including pollution reduction, affordable and quality housing, good jobs, sustainable livelihoods, and community infrastructure. And then you go on to say that this is going to require a holistic, non-market-based regulatory mechanism that really explicitly accounts for local impacts. And so this really gets at the heart of what you all are talking about. Could you just tell us more about what you think that might look like? What might that look like?
Well, first of all, it looks like a suite of policies,
right?
Which we understand are under various jurisdictions of various committees, but it will require an alignment of those suite of policies that develops, as we mentioned later, an environmental justice assessments about how those policies will actually have distributive impacts. Secondly, I think, and some of the work that several of us, including Michelle Roberts and Dr. Nikki Sheets and Dr. Ana Baptista, worked on with the Clean Power Plan, is to identify what are some strategies that we can ensure that that emissions reductions, both GHG reductions or carbon reductions, but also the most harmful for local communities, which are the co-pollutants that are also part of the fossil fuel combustion process, that we guarantee those emissions reductions in environmental justice communities. And so market policies without those kinds of safeguards and guardrails do not have the potential for reductions. In fact, there may be potential for increases in those communities.
Right.
So what we need are those safeguards in legislation, in every piece of climate mitigation legislation, and we need more robust EJ analysis of these proposed solutions.
Yeah. So this gets at something else that I'm really interested in as a organizer myself. I always believe that the best ideas are going to come from the grassroots, from people that are closest to the work and are going to understand best the work. And a lot of the messages that all of you are saying today is that the disproportionate impacts on local communities, indigenous communities, communities of color are felt there on the ground. But so what I'm trying to figure out is how can we protect this idea of local ownership while also, as we sit here in Washington, try to craft national strategies and national legislation? How do we make that work so that, I serve on the Indian Affairs Committee. We talk about this all the time in Indian Affairs. There's this call for consultation, but that's not the same as ownership. Right. And what advice do you have for how we can do that?
Well, in that, I actually defer to, in some ways, to my colleagues here,
Yeah.
because they are the ones that are doing the actual organizing of DJ communities on the ground, and trying to build the capacity of communities to both participate and understand the proposed legislative proposals, but also then to develop the technical capacity to provide the kind of feedback that you're looking for.
I welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, organizers the job is to organize yourself out of a job, to educate, empower the community for you not to be needed. You're not supposed to be the center of what the work is being done. And I think the importance is empowering leadership and for your offices to start having those relationships and communications with frontline environmental leaders to know what the realities are and what we think the solutions might be. A lot of the work that I do is state focused, and I'm just now looking at some of the federal stuff. But it's really important, I think, to start those conversations and to know that we're going to sometimes fail, that we're going to ask more from our senators, that sometimes the frontline communities are not going to be able to respond within 24 hours giving a decision when we're looking at policy and reading it for the first time, because we all have full-time jobs apart from the work that we do. But I think it's just important to start those communications and those relationships so that we both know how to best work together as we move forward and to know what are the priorities in those communities. And I'm sure there's a lot of communities across the nation that face the same problems. Coal plants are across the nation, ethylene oxide is across the nation, so we need some holistic answers, but we also need to be looking how each community is unique and how we can uplift what are those struggles at a federal level as well.
Part of what we do, thank you for that question. When you're thinking about environmental justice, you really have to look at it from a different perspective. As we indicated, a bottom-up approach means just that. And so with that said, we at the Environmental Justice Health Alliance work along with our communities to really help provide that capacity support that includes technical support. By training, I'm a scientist. Coming from a state whose political economy is based on that of the chemicals management system, we clearly understand that. But there is a better way of doing things. There are safer and more holistic ways of doing things. And so what we are doing with the Environmental Justice Health Alliance, just quickly, as I alluded to with this piece on the green zones, we have to look at the democratic process in a more holistic lens by including that of our communities. When we talk about going back to the civil rights movement, Delaware plays a unique role when you think about the contradictions of how we fought against ourselves in the Civil War, fast forwarding into Brown v. Board. And so what we mean by that is working locally with our elected officials, but then working with groups like the National Black Caucus of State Legislatures, who's that bridge to you all, the Congress. You've now created this Environmental Justice Caucus, and therefore we create model partnerships and processes that bring a new form of a democratic process and government response to the people that we say, car diem, right? Seize the day, and the day is now to do things differently than we did before.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you all for being here. Let me first take a moment to lift up my home state city of Providence, which has developed a climate justice plan with a lot of community input that is being very well received and stands as a model for other communities. and also the work that we saw done when this committee went up to New York to meet with the advocates who have supported the New York State legislation. And that community coalition was very, very effective. So we have good models as to how to do this right. It is very doable, and I'm really grateful that you all are here to help bring that message. In particular, Ms. Flores, one of the areas where communities often get overlooked is on the enforcement side. And we have seen, let me get the number right, that the number of EPA staff in your Chicago region has hit an all-time low, and that as a result, the number of EPA inspections are down 60% in that region. What are your thoughts about that unfortunate situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows that our current administration is targeting environmental justice communities. It's targeting our environment. And one of the reasons that a lot of my focus has been at the states to be able to see how can we hold the state accountable to this work while we pass these turbulent times at the federal level. But even I think at the state level, you know, the coal plant in Waukegan in 2012 was issued a notice of violation groundwater contamination coming from the coal plants, and it had from 2010 to 2012 the Waukegan coal plant had over 154 violations from exceeding safe levels of toxic chemicals from the EPA. So these are things that the community doesn't know about unless there are people like Clean Power Lake County, like Faith in Place, local scientists that live in our community that are informing and educating. And I think this information needs to be public. When I look for information on the Superfund sites, there's supposed to be a report out that came out this year, and I can't download it. It's not there. So I had to send an email, and I'm waiting to hear back. So the problem is that there isn't enough communication, and you know we're not able to hold these agencies accountable. So we need to pass legislation where we hold them accountable, and we continue to do that. And it's something that is an ongoing process, and that's why we need you senators, we need everyone to be an ally with environmental justice communities to make sure that this information is not only provided in English, but in the language that the community also predominantly speaks. Like I said, Waukegan is predominantly Latinx and African American. We need everything translated, especially if it's about their public health, because how can you be part of the process if you don't understand what's going on?
My experience has been that when politics is jammed up by powerful polluters, particularly ones who have been given immense new political weaponry by the Citizens United decision and the ability to hide who they are by spending dark money, one of the resources still available is to demand enforcement of the laws as they are presently written. And so if you come across situations in which you feel that the enforcement is not being done consistent with existing law, one of the things we can do, even while the other party and the polluters are jamming up the Senate on this issue, is to demand enforcement and to show a spotlight on these gaps. So please don't hesitate to put us to work in that respect. Ms. Roberts, you wanted to respond?
Yes, sir. We could totally use your help in the great state of Delaware right now in the response to the Crota debacle a year ago today, basically over the Thanksgiving holiday, where it shut down the Delaware Memorial Bridge on both sides of the bridge, New Jersey and Delaware. The health department never came out. The state DEP said that everything was okay, don't worry, as people wandered aimlessly through the streets of the Route 9 industrial corridor near Southbridge and others where my family's from. In addition to that, now it is our understanding 1 year later that facility is granted the opportunity to reopen. There's never been any monitoring or anything. The communities have been asking for it all up and down the Route 9 industrial corridor to no response. And Senator Carper and Senator Whitehouse, we need you on the ground right now on Route 9 to respond to this Crota debacle where they are not a good neighbor, and they are, in our opinion, part of this Citizens United, feeling like they could do whatever they want to the communities, and that cannot be. Thank you for that offer.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Senator McLean.
Thank you, for all three of you, for your testimony and for your leadership on environmental justice. And Ms. Flores, did SB 9, the Coal Ash Cleanup and Storage Act, pass after you advocated for it?
It did.
It did, so congratulations.
Now we're trying to make sure that the Illinois EPA is going to enforce it properly, and rule drafting is the next step.
No, that's great, because in your testimony, I was reading about the lack of liners and the toxics that have leaked into the water base, and then the liners weren't up to snuff. And just recently, the Trump administration is relaxing the rules for these coal ash ponds and the regulation and the inspections of them, which is just absolutely insane when it comes to public health. So, it's an example. Have you all backed a candidate for the Illinois legislature to try to get your voice inside that body?
No, there is a local community activist that is running at the state level and trying to get on the ballot. So we'll see how that goes. But Clean Power Lake County itself doesn't do that.
I keep thinking about how often when we actually change things, there's an outside force organizing the community, as all of you have been doing, and then you got to get the folks inside force as well to work in partnership. And that's what we're trying to do right here as an inside force. You're the outside force. We're trying to amplify, magnify the power of that effort. You also mentioned that 1 out of 3 children have asthma or asthma-like symptoms in your community. I mean, that's a stunning number, and that probably it's the coal ash ponds, I think, is the likely culprit. But then you also mentioned ethylene oxide being emitted directly in the air, a class 1 carcinogen. Have you seen higher than average rates of cancer in your community?
So that's what we're pushing to get a cancer cluster study. The Lake County Health Department has not initiated one, and we haven't had success at the state level getting things on board. But that's our next step, because we're working on legislation, but unfortunately at the state level, the legislation HB 3888 became a not in my backyard legislation, and that was something that as an environmental justice community, we could not support this ETO going into other communities in the area. So we're looking at how can we get more science, more facts behind us so that our representatives don't have any reason to not push forward strong legislation that covers all Illinois.
Thank you for your advocacy. It's very, very powerful. And Ms. Roberts, you note in your testimony that there is a lot of suspicion in the environmental justice community about putting a price on carbon or cap and trade or cap and dividend because they don't guarantee emission reductions in environmental justice communities. And there was a lot of interest in the possibility of putting a price on carbon, because when a price was put on sulfur dioxide, the rate of sulfur dioxide pollution decreased dramatically, faster than anyone expected, because essentially it created a bonus if you could invent a way to reduce it, and some people were motivated by implementing that to earn those bonuses. But you're making a powerful point that it might actually even concentrate pollution more in communities that are also suffering. So I think that's an important thing for us to hear and understand better, and you want to share a little bit about your perspectives on that?
Yes, it is equally important that we must address those, because with that increase in emissions is increase in health issues. I just left the Christiana Hospital, where it's 99.9% filled for the past 2 weeks, where my father was hospitalized. We had to really advocate to get my father, who was originally from Southbridge community, we had to advocate very hard while he got the exceptional care at the Christiana Care this past couple of weeks. But we as a family had to really advocate to get him moved into the heart and vascular unit where his situation was occurring, and the problem was that there were no beds. And in addition to that, equal problems is that the health deliverable systems are not effectively communicating one with the other. Why does this all matter? This all matters because at the end of the day, we need to advocate for our health and well-being against state health departments who say that it is not it is not about the pollutants and the impacts of the pollutants on our health disparities, but it is our lifestyles. And that is the case in point in Delaware, where we had a peer-reviewed report where we also had solutions identified in there, but we could not even get past the base level. So it's very important that if we're not going to be able to make those connections at our state level, that we must go to the full Monty and seize the day to look at all of the emissions that are impacting our communities in totality as opposed to a siloed approach.
So my time's up, but I just want to mention that Portland, Oregon passed a clean energy jobs bill designed by the environmental and social justice community that put a 1% revenue tax on the largest companies, and then those funds are being used to hire people in the frontline communities to develop specific actions to attack these sources of pollution where they are worst. And so that passed by 30%. When people thought it would go down because so many other strategies are going down across the country. And so just something we're proud of in Oregon, and something I want to publicize a little bit for because resources to tackle the problems you're talking about could come perhaps by looking at Portland's work. Thanks.
Thank you. We are in the middle of a vote. I'm going to step away to vote and come back, but Senator Carper, and then if Senator Baldwin wants to begin a second round, he can. Thank you. And I will be right back.
Again, our thanks to you for coming for Delaware. It's not that far. I do that almost every day, but from other places it's a lot further, so we appreciate that. I mentioned earlier that just on the other side of the Christina River from the Biden train station is an area that we call Southbridge, and where it floods. Any kind of rain above, just like a light drizzle, we see flooding. We have to elevate the roads to make sure that we still can get through that part of our city. There's a project that's been ongoing there. I like to say in adversity lies opportunity. And in the midst of that, the adversity, the flooding, has come an idea to create I have, my staff is good enough to pull up on their handheld device a little bit of information about a 14-acre wetland park that is being created. And instead of having to worry all about flooding, why don't we take what is a nuisance, blight on that community, and turn it into something that's going to be lovely and attractive and make it just a more enjoyable place to live. And that's that's an industry project. It's not a cheap project. It's about $25 million, state and local money, so I think some federal money as well. But that's it's one example of what we can do. I've asked my staff to figure out when, with respect to quota, when has the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control held public hearings? Thank you. Apparently the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection held a public hearing on June 7th, 2019, and I'm going to ask to be briefed on a hearing, find out what actually happened. Did people come? Did people show up? I have a chance to see what was said and what was spoken, and so I appreciate you bringing that to our attention, Ms. Roberts. I want to ask a question, and then I want to talk a little bit about some things that we're doing to try to get people off of roads, highways, bridges, out of their cars, out of their trucks. We can get more people in transit, more people on riding Amtrak, to move us away from driving vehicles that burn diesel fuel, that burn gasoline, and simply put up all kinds of pollution into the air. The reason why I raise that is because the greatest source of pollution in our country comes from mobile sources, our cars, trucks, and vans. Second greatest sources, and you may have mentioned Dr. Martinez, second greatest source comes from power plants, and that used to be number one, and that's coming down, and we have the Clean Power Plan. If this administration, we're just trying to get rid of that. If we can somehow be successful in court or in the next administration, maybe a year or so from now, to actually reinstate the Clean Power Plan. Clean Power Plan is, as you may know, is going to promise us to reduce emissions from some of major pollutants by as much as a third in a relatively brief period of time. And so we're going to stay on top of that. Here's my question, though, and it involves EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. And I would just ask, this is a question for all of our witnesses, but if you choose not to respond to this one, you don't have to. But for anyone who'd like to, how would you rate EPA's Office of Environmental Justice? And could that serve as a template for enhanced engagement that could be replicated in other agencies? I'll say that again. How would you rate EPA's Office of Environmental Justice, and could that serve as a template for enhanced engagement that could be replicated in other agencies? Please.
Just very quickly, the Office of Environmental Justice at the EPA has been removed from the Office of the Administrator and placed in the Office of Policy, which none of the EJ communities agreed with. But if I could just quickly mention something about
Please.
the wetlands project. While we respectfully appreciate that project, the fact remains that we amended the Coastal Zone Act, but did not address legacy pollution. So it grandfathered in legacy polluters along that industrial corridor. And at the very time that we speak, that project that is yet to be completed, there's magnitudes of flooding continuing. And in addition to that, there's heavy metals and polluted other pollution that are washing away and are in the flood waters of those communities. So with that said, that all matters, because if we don't have a connection to the Office of Environmental Justice to enforce and make sure that EJ communities are taken care of in even high finance projects, it will go for naught.
All right, thank you. Anybody else on the question, the issue of the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice? And then I'm going to have to run and vote, or I'll miss my opportunity.
Yeah, I think the EJ community has always been highly supportive of the Office of EJ, and not only for the work that it does, but also the fact that it needs to be increased and staffed up. It is not a large office. It has a lot of work that it needs to be doing. Very definitely, the Office of EJ does important work. And we should not also neglect to say that it can only do as much as a single office can do. What is more critically important is that environmental justice and equity be incorporated into every aspect of the EPA. You mentioned the Clean Power Plan, which, yes, indeed, I think environmental justice communities were very happy to see a rule that came forward that would address climate change. But a very important component of the Clean Power Plan, and it's stated in the rule itself, is that emissions may increase in certain communities as a result of the implementation of the CPP. There was not effective equity analysis and EJ analysis done in the development of the Clean Power Plan, and that's why we need environmental justice assessments and equity assessments in every part of EPA.
Thank you. I'm going to run and vote, and we have another vote after that. So I hope to be back before you leave. But if I'm not, just thank you so much. It's great to see you, see both of you, and to meet you. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you.
I yield.
Senator Baldwin.
Great, thank you. I'm just really pleased to have the three of you here to present us with ideas, your expertise, and your testimonies. I said earlier that I wanted to follow up with a question about specifically toxic chemical pollution. And I'll start with you, Ms. Roberts. In 2017, the EPA investigated a company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that cleaned and recycled containers that are used to store industrial chemicals. The EPA uncovered evidence suggesting that multiple facilities of the same company had improperly handled hazardous chemicals, and from time to time allowing them to be released into the surrounding communities. In this case, a residential area, a fairly low-income residential area. The company's facilities also in their various locations, at least one of them was near an elementary school. Given your experience working on toxic chemical pollution challenges, I'm wondering if there are specific tools that we should be thinking about as we make recommendations to develop legislation that are particularly helpful to empower frontline communities to address similar situations of acute toxic industrial pollution.
We thank you so very much for that question, because our communities and the Environmental Justice Health Alliance have been advocating for many, many years for us to really address how we manage our chemicals management portfolio. We have safer chemicals and processes that can be incorporated into our chemical industrial process, if you will. But that has not been mandated. We also need to address and identify where some of these high-risk chemical facilities are with respect to our water deliverable systems, our schools, and what have you. Sad to say, just for example, with the water deliverable systems, there's no database that shows where these facilities are located within the water deliverable system. And when you look at communities like what took place at the Elk River disaster, it creates even more of a threat to not only the schools but the surrounding communities. So we must have a better way of addressing this permitting, incorporating safer chemicals. In addition to that, making sure that the health departments are plugged in, and better infrastructure development.
Dr. Martinez, did you have
I was just going to affirm what Ms. Roberts stated, and that I think a really critical, that it's permitting and enforcement. Those are the two critical areas. And right now, unfortunately, EJ communities don't have a hook, or states or to have a hook to deny a permit based on cumulative risk and cumulative impact. That has to change, and that's why we also incorporated cumulative impacts as part of our strategy for climate mitigation as well.
Okay, thank you. I have a final question. With extreme weather, I'm concerned about the hazards to workers, particularly workers who spend their days outside and are uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. I recently highlighted this concern to the Secretary of Labor, calling upon him to establish rules to require employers to address risks that extreme weather like heat poses to employees on the job. How can the federal government best protect outdoor workers from extreme weather conditions that will be worsened by climate change? For anyone who wants to jump in and tackle that.
I'll admit that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. Obviously, as a policy and as a problem, we absolutely support your effort in dealing with that. Not only is it a problem for outdoor workers, but there's a number of other occupational and health and safety issues that particularly befall on laborers of color. And those laborers that may be undocumented. And if we are to be humane as a society, if we're to live up to principles of democracy and justice, we cannot be leaving those communities behind. So we would highly support any effort to do that.
Thank you.
We actually have a collective work process we call our chemicals disasters group, if you will. And it's a unique group because it consists of allies and advocates that are not just workers, but communities who are fence line to these spaces, and occupational health folks and science and what have you. And we welcome the opportunity to meet with you and discuss the solutions that we have been working on and towards, because of the fact that this will indeed include folks from the support of the Chemical Safety Board to remain in place, which is one of the pieces that's being threatened to be dismantled. We're like, yes, and so we would welcome the opportunity, and I think it's again going back to this EJ caucus that has been established. It's a very important and useful tool, in our opinion, to be able to provide space for collectives such as what we're doing with the chemical disaster work, to be able to sit down with you and have these discussions and potential briefings and or hearings, or in district meetings. And these are the types of things that we need when we're talking about a bottom-up process. Yes, we need to discuss these things on Capitol Hill, but equally, when you go to your in-home districts, this is where we engage those state and regional partners, and folks like us at this table and broader and beyond are able to collectively work with you for us to have that more perfect union and be able to seize the day for the people.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. I will now begin my series of questions. I think one of the things that struck me about the conversation so far is about the need for the EJ community to have a seat at the table. I mean, I want to throw it to especially to Ms. Flores and Ms. Roberts to address this issue. The deep pocket industry interests, they have legions of corporate lobbyists, and they can guarantee that their voices are well represented in the halls of Congress and during the rulemaking process. You mentioned, Ms. Roberts, this caucus is a way for you to have a say. Low-income communities and communities of color are rarely consulted in a proactive manner when it comes to developing policy that directly impacts their well-being, and that must change. And the EJ caucus works towards that. But I'd like to hear from you, and maybe we'll start with Ms. Flores, about how can what are your recommendations on how Congress can make sure that your communities, the communities that are most at risk of suffering environmental harm, are included in a policy development and rulemaking process beyond like running someone so that they can, take office themselves. But I just think that getting the process right is critical to ensuring the mistakes made yesterday are not repeated tomorrow. So how do we get you more in that process beyond, say, this caucus? Because we're talking about rulemaking, we're talking about policy development, we're talking about implementing how we implement laws once they're passed, for example.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Duckworth. I mean, I think it's really important that we go back and the senators go back to their districts and see who are those frontline environmental justice leaders and who are they working with, who can they bring up to become educated and doing all this work. I mean, I know I stand on shoulders of amazing women of color, POCs, that have been doing this work, and I'm learning this now, and I've been doing youth programs in the summer trying to get people in Waukegan, students in Gurnee, to realize that this is something that they can do, that this is part of day-to-day, that they can own wanting to write policy for their community and improve their community rather than just saying, I'm just trying to get out of the suburbs. I mean, I was that 18-year-old that wanted to leave home and came back. But I think most importantly is when you invite someone to the table to start discussing policy, for them to become that expert and for them to show that someone else. But when we're looking at policy, it's not just about looking at it in silos. And I think I think we're in consensus that we need a holistic approach. And we also need something that really starts to incentivize the communities economically. I think a lot of these communities have felt abandoned by the industrial boom, have felt abandoned by local governments, and there's no desire to re-engage. But there is a desire when it comes now to renewable energy. There's that question in the air of like, is this actually going to come to my community? What is this going to look like? So I think it's really important that we make sure that these profits of renewable energy come to these communities and that we end subsidizing these old industries like nuclear, like coal, that we don't have this capacity market reform where this coal plant that's over 100 years old continues to be on the PJM grid because it's more profitable than doing renewable energies in our state. So I think there's a lot of different things that we've talked about moving forward that we can do together. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And in fact, I've introduced legislation that would provide assistance to the owners of low-income housing, say Section 8 housing, to actually encourage them to put solar panels on those on low-income housing, because in fact the people who live in those communities spend the greatest percentage of their income on energy costs, yet they pay the most and for the dirtiest energy often. And so we need to, certainly those are the types of legislation that we need to be passing. And as many in this room are well aware, the environmental justice movement has not been welcomed in all corners. One of the most insidious critiques that I've heard is that the EJ movement is a so-called negative movement that is quick to say no and unwilling to accept pragmatic solutions. Since I'm willing to bet that many who are making these criticisms have not read the actual EJ platform that was recently published, along with something like 200 signatories, I would like to ask that each of you share your view on the proactive solutions and positive visions that are part of that proposal. Dr. Martinez?
Well, first of all, I think the fact that we, as major environmental organizations, policy think tanks, scientific organizations, and environmental justice communities came together and flushed out for over a year what the positive solutions are going to be. What is the frame for effective and just, equitable climate action? That I do not want to underestimate the historic document, that historic document. I think it just goes to show that we can work together, that environmental justice communities have been identifying policy solutions. In fact, if you look at that platform, the EJ community, the EJ leaders were the one that constructed the very first draft of that entire platform. Those ideas came from environmental justice leaders based on their experience and based on what they wanted. So the idea that we do not have those answers or that we're constantly saying no is obviously not an appropriate characterization. But more importantly, I think it's important also to recognize that environmental justice communities will say no when the kind of policy solutions that are being brought to them is going to negatively impact their community. We will never, ever say yes to things that we know are going to impair the health of all our communities. So yes, we will say no, but we definitely have policy solutions.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that.
You have a cough like I do. I caught mine from my 18-month-old who caught it from her 5-year-old who caught it from preschool. So this is why I have 2 cups of hot tea, and I apologize.
Thank you for that. Equally, and that my cough reminds me, it's as many of our communities call it the EJ cough, when we go in and out of our communities, which I was actually over the past couple of weeks. And so I say that to say, as we participated, we EJHA affiliates participated in this equitable and just climate process. And what was so rewarding for us was taking this back and forth, right? Being that bridge of taking it back and forth to our local communities on the ground who saw themselves in that. Equally in the evolution of the Environmental Justice Act, the various acts that are out now, they see themselves in it. So our communities educate themselves in addition to learning about these processes. And just very quickly, the other night, even we had a call where one of the Hill staff members was explaining this new pop fox, if you will. So I say that to say our communities educate themselves before they say no. They say no with authority, right? They know what it is that is necessary for the justice that they need to make sure that their communities are healthy and whole, and that it's the beloved communities that many of my ancestors have fought for and continue to fight for. And so therefore, we will say yes and we will say no with authority, but what we welcome most is being able to be at the table from the beginning through the end, and for us, that's what brings the justice. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Flores?
Yeah, coming into this and seeing all the work that I had been doing on this platform, I think it really reminded me of the importance of learning that you have a powerful voice, even if you're in a community where you don't think you have one. and being able to own that. I was at a leadership conference and someone asked me, like, when do you stop when do you stop feeling like an imposter in the organization you're working with when you're giving ideas? And I'm like, we're all making it up as we go. And I think for environmental justice communities, we've seen the devastation, we've seen the pollution, and I think these principles that were outlined that all these big greens signed on to, I think environmental justice leaders were able to draw that line in the sand and say, this is where we need to start from. We need equity at the center. We need environmental justice voices being centered. Are you going to be on this journey with us? And a lot of them said yes. And it was a back and forth. And I think that's what's most important is that we feel like we have our elected officials, that we know we have our community that's backing us when we're drawing those lines, because we know and we've seen and we live with all of the pollution, all of the toxic chemicals. So when we say no, it's because we know it's going to also not harm our community directly, but maybe another one, and we can't stand for that. So environmental justice is a huge umbrella, and it's not just about getting one thing done quickly. It's about really looking holistically at the future too, because we're thinking about those future generations and how this policy is going to affect them. And that's why it's so critical that we get it right in so many ways. I mean, we talk about renewable energy. I've been learning about energy storage. I went to a convening and I was like, why am I here? They're like, well, because you work on the ground. I was like, I don't know how any of these batteries work. They're like, we're going to teach you. Don't worry, because we need you to go back to the community to make sure that we are getting this right. So I think we're seeing environmental organizations that are actually realizing that they need equity centered, and there may be still a long way away, but that's why we're here as environmental justice leaders, to hold them accountable, to make sure that they're not just saying, oh, we signed on to the HEMES principles, but they're actually following through, and it's not a piece of paper that's collecting dust in someone's desk, but it's actually being practiced. And it takes a lot, because we have to be the ones that bring that up in every conversation to make sure we're holding them accountable. So it's great to know that this caucus is going to be able to ally with us to make sure that it's not just us carrying that burden.
Thank you. I think that's very well said, and I think that's a good point to end our discussion today. The beeps that you just heard was the second round of votes being called. It's the nation's budget to keep us from a government shutdown, which is why everybody we're in a continuing resolution on the budget. And that's what the votes are, which is why my colleagues have not returned. It's a series of 3 votes. They just called the second vote, which I will have to join. I want to thank each one of you for the discussions today. I also want to say that as we talk about the seats at the table, one of the things we need to really focus on, I think, and I don't think we've really discussed it today, and something we should talk about in the future, is that one of the main areas of alignment among the members of the environmental justice movement is we have a desire to reduce carbon emissions, but also create high-quality jobs, right? We talk about environmental justice. We have to fix the legacy pollutions, but we should be creating these jobs in these communities so that people don't want to flee the community. So people want to come home to these good jobs that are fixing the community to a good community that you can live in, a clean community to raise your kids in without fear of asthma, cancer, all of that. But also that you can actually now be a part of an industry through working for with organized labor, for example, that will provide good paying jobs to working families who can now be working towards that carbon neutral future for our kids. I just want to thank you all for sharing your testimony with us. I am absolutely, and all of us are grateful for your advocacy and for your willingness to share your expertise and experience. As I mentioned in my opening, I hope that you will see that today's hearing is the first of many meetings and conversations we will have as we work together to ensure justice is the backbone of climate action. And when we say environmental justice, it's not just about the environment, it's about the holistic approach to the communities, the legacy pollution, but also the future for our kids. And that's more, it is the air we breathe, it is the pollution that we fix, but it's also policies moving well into the future and jobs as well to grow in equal ways. So thank you so much for being here. The record will remain open for any additional submissions that witnesses might want to make, as well as my colleagues. And with that, we are adjourned. Okay, I'm going to take just that one. Yeah. Here, I'm going to give you this one because I don't like ginger. But thank you. All right, thank you. I'm sorry I have to run, ladies. I'm
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.
I was just looking at you like.